Hello and welcome back to the Electrical Building Design Show. I'm your host, David Robison. Today I'm joined by my co-host, Mark Robison. We're going to talk about series-rated breakers. First, I want to ask about fault. What is fault and why is that something that electrical engineers are concerned with?
Well, Dave, fault is what happens when two wires in a power system get connected together and a lot of current flows. And depending upon how the electrical system is built, you either get a lot of current or a little bit of current. And the important thing for a breaker is to open up and stop this current from flowing, because obviously it's an avalanche of energy that can cause damage, fires, etc. And a breaker, in order to open up, has to be robust enough to overcome all the physical stress of the magnetic fields and be able to open without welding the contacts together in the process.
All right, so how do series-rated breakers play into this conversation about fault?
Well, as I was saying, the breaker needs to be robust enough to interrupt the available fault at the location of the breaker. However, sometimes these faults are huge, and making a breaker or all the breakers robust enough to handle the fault can be very expensive. So someone came up with the clever idea, why not use two breakers in series to handle the fault and allow the downstream breaker to be of lesser rating?
Did you ever use any series-rated breakers on projects?
Yes, they're used often. Many times they're just used in buildings where, well, there's, for example, a hotel. A lot of times you've got a large electrical room in the center of the hotel, and the fault at that location is quite high. And immediately nearby, you have panels that have just 20 amp breakers on them, serving lights and receptacles. Well, those panels that are, just a few feet away from the main electrical room still see the same fault that the main switchgear sees. So you may have a 65,000 amp rated breaker on your main service, which is not a big deal because there's not very many breakers. But downstream, you've got a panel with 40 or 50 breakers, and having each one of those rated for 65,000 amps is extremely expensive.
All right, so what are series-rated breakers?
A series-rated breaker is one that is rated by the manufacturer to function in combination with two breakers, such that the upstream breaker protects the downstream breaker, so that the downstream breaker doesn't have to actually withstand the full fault. So you could have a 10,000 amp rated breaker downstream with a very high fault, and I'm just going to make up a number, 60 or 70,000 amps. If it's connected to a breaker that can handle the 60 or 70,000 amps and operate fast enough to protect the downstream breaker. Now, when the upstream breaker protects the downstream breaker, the implication is that the upstream breaker trips. And this is the opposite of what we call a coordinated system. A coordinated system is one where only the smallest, most downstream breaker trips and everything else remains operational. And the series-rated breaker basically ignores that rule and says, no, let's have the upstream breaker also trip, and the cost savings are significant, and therefore it's okay to allow that to happen.
So the series-rated breakers are a trade-off then between cost and having a coordinated system.
Yes, if every breaker were fully rated and coordinated, the cost could be very high. And the series-rated breaker concept allows cost savings, less robust breakers. I won't say less quality, because the breakers are all high quality. But in order to manufacture a breaker that can open up against very high fault current, it has to be able to withstand huge magnetic fields, which are tugging at all the metallic parts of the breaker. And it has to withstand the heat generated by the arc when the contacts open at first. And this heat can actually weld the contacts together, creating a bolted fault, which then eventually results in the breaker burning up, exploding, fire, all kinds of bad things. So basically, we're trading off coordination for cost.
Is it possible to do series-rated breakers where only the downstream breaker trips?
Well, that would be wonderful, but that's almost exactly the opposite of what a series rated breaker is about. The whole point is that the downstream breaker isn't capable of opening up against the fault that it has available. Therefore, the upstream breaker has to help. And in order to help, the upstream breaker has to open. And hopefully, the idea is to open up before the downstream breaker experiences damage. You might ask the question, well, how do you know the upstream breaker is going to trip and protect the downstream breaker? Well, that's where the series rating by the manufacturer comes into play. You can't just take any two breakers and say these are series rated. You have to have the manufacturer do the testing and certification that these breakers, when working in conjunction, will have the upstream breaker trip first.
So the series rating is specified by the manufacturer. Where do you find the information for those, whether the breaker is series rated or not?
This is something that you have to count on the manufacturer to provide. When you specify a series rated system, or let's rephrase it, when you allow a series rated system, because generally this is an option that contractors, would like to choose, the contractor will go with his brand of breaker, his supplier, and say you'd like to have these systems series rated, and the manufacturer will run the calculations. Basically, they run the fault calcs over again and confirm that testing that they've done on their sets of breakers are within tolerance of the expected faults. And so when you get your shop drawings, they will say on them that these are series rated for the application. It's not something that the engineer designing the building can do. It has to be the manufacturer has to say that it's okay.
So the engineer specifies that they say that we can allow a series rated breaker in this case. And then the contractor is going to be the one to actually get the breakers that are series rated, work with the manufacturer to make sure that you have the appropriate equipment.
That is correct.
Are there times you shouldn't use series rated breakers?
Well, definitely when you want a coordinated system, you should not use series rated breakers because let's just take a simple example. If you've got a switchboard with a breaker serving a panel and it's got a fault on a little 20 amp circuit and the upstream breaker trips, well, the entire panel goes out, which means all the circuits, all the loads that are served by that panel lose power. And if that's not acceptable, then you have to go with fully rated breakers.
Are there any regional differences in codes on whether series rated breakers are allowed?
Yes, it's important to check in with the authority having jurisdiction as to whether or not they will allow series rated breakers, because obviously a series rated breaker counts on a lot of things. They have to be certified that they're rated to be in series, and some jurisdictions have concerns about, well, okay, the maintenance guy 5 years from now replaces that downstream breaker with a similar breaker, but it's not quite the same, or the manufacturer changes their ratings. So it's important to check with the authority having jurisdiction to confirm that they're allowed. And sometimes you can just put that on the drawings and say series rated breakers if allowed by the AHJ. And a long time ago, Los Angeles was reticent to allow series rated breakers. I'm not sure what their stand today is, but that's the whole point. These are rules made up by people, and they're always subject to change. So you have to keep checking on it.
Thank you for sharing your experiences with series rated breakers with us today.
I hope this has been helpful. I think the main message that I'm trying to share is that series rated breakers are not magic. They have a compromise. There's a trade-off. And if it's okay that the upstream breaker trips when there's a fault on a downstream breaker, then series rated breakers are a very good option. They reduce cost, and well, cost is important. But if that is not an acceptable compromise, then you have to use fully rated breakers.
So the next time you're working on your fault calculations for a project, keep series rated breakers in mind as a possible solution.